Hey and welcome back to my channel. I have been quiet for a couple of months now, and the reason being that I was a bit burnt out of this project. Uh, but it was actually unrelated to this project. I was burned out by a few work-related things, and I haven't had like mental capacity to work on this project. Anyway, um, I found my energy back about 2 months ago, and I progressed actually quite well on this project, and I wanted to give you a status update. So, for everyone who's joining in for the first time here on this channel and my journey on the Quake Shack, let's give you a quick recap. Why this project? I started this project actually because during the Christmas holidays, I got a little bit bored, and I always had an affinity for game engines, even though I'm not a game developer. And my journey actually begins when I was, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years old at this time. And I discovered back then a game called Doom. I think some of you might be familiar with it. And not just that, I think a year later I discovered actually Half-Life. And for some reason, Doom and Half-Life, they really sucked me into like game development and actually made me learn programming in the first place. Um, Even though like I said before, I'm not a game developer, I always had this passion for games. I played Doom, I played like any id Software game at the time. I played Half-Life, I played Counter-Strike like everyone at the time. And but it was not just a game I was fascinated with. I was also fascinated with the technology behind it. I always wanted to build my own things in those games. So I started learning map editors, the source code, learning C by tinkering around with Doom, later Quake. And then I came across Half-Life. Half-Life was quite interesting because um, if you come from like learning these engines and you're learning programming from these engines, you get really interesting like perspective from seeing how someone else took this engine and built something on top of it. So Half-Life was one of those, yeah, parties who took the engine and built something on top of it. And yeah, Half-Life was one thing. I was always fascinated hearing like, oh, they took Quake and they completely turned it around, added so many features, and I was always like interested like how did they actually do it and pull it off. Um, Around 2002, this happened. Like the early Half-Life 2 leak happened, and I was really fascinated by seeing those graphics and whatnot. And I have to admit, back then when the leak happened, I was actually peeking into the source code of the source engine back then. And it was really fascinating to me to see what actually Valve did with Quake and how they turned it from C to C++. And I always had this curiosity. For instance, I built this thingy where I started working on a wrapper for the Linux version of Half-Life, being able to load actually game code, which is written for Windows. And I enjoyed quite a lot learning about calling conventions in C and stuff. But I managed to pull this off. Like this is Pokey 646, which is a really cool mod for Half-Life. Back then, it didn't have a Linux version, I think, and I took the challenge to write the wrapper using load library. I also contributed to that project. I found discovered the bug. Anyway, I was always interested with Half-Life, how they actually replaced the game code uh, back then in Quake, written in Quake C, and how they replaced it actually with something written in C++ and using OOP to actually make their lives easier. Yeah. Anyway, let's move forward. Why did I decide to put this on YouTube? So there's actually a quite interesting community around everything source, code source, tech engines related. So for instance, we have Half-Life Feature Full SDK by the great people over at Xash 3D who wrote actually an implementation of code source, which is really interesting to read, by the way. I also discovered that they added some load library and wine DLL loading shenanigans into their engines, so they could actually um, start and be able to run Half-Life mods written for Windows, also on Linux, and I think Android. So it's really crazy. You have to check this out. Also, there are a few other people like Pinsplash, which is also really interesting. I like his title, Source Engine Enthusiast. I think he spent thousands of hours in anything Half-Life and Half-Life 2. Really interesting content. Also, like Matt's ramblings, which was really interesting. He actually, I learned quite a lot of it from him. He was especially like collision detection and the overbounds thingy, where he explained why the bunny hub was actually working. Super interesting, fascinated. I highly recommend checking him out. There are also some other projects like Key 2, where I contributed to Key 2's, the founder of Key 2's Quake 2 project. Um, yeah, it's really interesting to see that there's such a strong community and everyone is working on something related to Quake or Half-Life. So this is really interesting, and there are a few other channels I also really like listening to, like Casey Muratori. Fascinating content. Always like listening to this guy. He got such a high energy. Anyway, so far so good. This is why I created this project. I got bored. I always had this curiosity for it and everything. And there's this thriving community around those game engines. And yeah, I took it from there, added feature by feature, like things I always wanted to play around with, but never had really the capacity or like experience and skill for this. So yeah, what happened so far? I found this really cool implementation of Quake 1 um for in WebGL and JavaScript. And like I said before, I'm always curious to see like people working on Quake or like Quake related engines and how they like did something built something on top of it, like what Valve did with the game code in C++, sitting on top of Quake 1 basically. And so I'm always interested, like, okay, how when people are porting over like things like that, like Quake from C to JavaScript, are they actually using features from JavaScript, like language features like OOP or like this weird version of OOP which JavaScript is providing? And turned out, his fork, by the way, not talking bad about him, really really good work he did. He ported the things almost verbatim. So there's like lots of concepts and structures you would see from C. Like I found a couple of linked lists which are linked in a ring. Lots of array work and objects and stuff. And I was like, you can actually, I don't know, do it a little bit better. But again, not to say that he did an awful job. Actually, he did an amazing job pulling this off. Because there are some people, they just use WebAssembly, and they simply cross compile like the game engine to some binary code and then execute it in the browser. But this is more interesting, so he did put more effort into it. Anyway, so I took his code. I was like, okay, let's it's quite dated actually. I think this his GitHub repository or their GitHub repository, it's like 6 years old at least, and I think the code is even older than that because it's using JavaScript from at least 10 years ago. So I I did dive into it, and I looked into a few couple of things I discovered right off the bat, like sound stuttering or like some weird issues with blocking the main thread, for instance. Like, let's talk about async versus sync IO in his part. Because back then Quake, everything was running in one single thread. So if it was waiting for some game assets to be loaded, it would stand still, give you a static screen, just saying loading and load it. And whenever it was finished with loading, Quake would jump back to the main loop. There was no in between updates, there was no multi threading because Quake was written for DOS, and DOS was single threaded all the way. Even there was no like no processes. There's one thing the CPU was working on. That's it. Anyway, what does it mean in modern terms? Like, I think everyone knows this neat pop-up from Chrome where it's warning about the website being unresponsive. This is mostly caused if the main thread in JavaScript is wasting CPU cycles and it's not yielding to the rendering thread. And this happened quite a lot. So this was one thing I was working on this project. Like, okay, let's see how can we optimize this? How can we actually use async IO to yield some time to the renderer. And I came up with rewriting some of the structures like functions being async, and this would like not really do things in parallel, but it would appear to be in parallel. So whenever it was waiting for something like reading from disk, like network IO in this case, it would basically give control back to the main loop of JavaScript, or in this case, the main loop of the game, which instantly had some interesting benefits. Because if you see, well, take a look at this one, you can see that there's like files being fetched. There are quite a lot of files, game assets. There are a lot of sound samples, models, textures, whatnot. And you can see that they are stacking. They're running in parallel now. So it's loading like here. You can see every time there's a batch of promises being resolved at the same time. And this was already giving some performance boost. This was really cool to see. So yeah, this was one thing I fixed in the beginning early on of this project, or like worked on. The next thing I added back networking. There was some code already indicating that the original author was working on some networking support, but it wasn't complete. I completed it. I split up the code into the dedicated and the frontend part. And yeah, I got back networking using WebSockets. So you can see on the left side, there's some binary messages going back and forth. This is basically like what Quake back then used to send over the network using UDP. Here we are using WebSockets, and I enhanced the protocol a little bit. And on the right hand side, you see the basically the console output of the dedicated server. And there's also like a connecting screen, which I implemented because, like I said, Quake back then, it would simply pause refreshing the screen and rendering anything. It would simply show you a loading screen and you wouldn't really see what is happening. But now, since I'm actually yielding to the renderer while waiting for resources and connecting to the server here, I can actually refresh the screen and I can show a status message, which is quite nice. Anyway, what else happened? I started re-implementing Quake 1, the game logic, in modern JavaScript. So early on, I already talked about Quake C, which Quake C is a scripting language id Software came up with to enable people who wanted to write mods for Quake to build more sophisticated mods, which happened a lot. And Quake C is somewhat of a C dialect. It's quite simplified. And when Valve started working on Half-Life, I think the first thing they did, they kicked out Quake C and they re-implemented the game logic in C++. So this was the big inspiration for me to also look into modern JavaScript and rewrite the Quake C game logic. I think I have put online a few videos on this, on the early progress, where it started like stopping out everything. And then it took me quite some time to re-implement all those entity handlers, so like entity classes in that case, and come up with a structure which is somewhat okay. But somewhere during all of this, I discovered that I might have been too close to the Quake C logic. But anyway, this is what happened. On the left side, you see items.qc, the original game code written in Quake C. And on the on the right hand side, you see items.mjs, which stands for modular JavaScript. You can see I implemented like base web entity classes. You can derive from them. You can set up easily your own entity classes. I still copied over the Quaked annotation that I can simply export like a list of supported entity classes from the source code and stuff. This all works really well. And yeah, I took it to the next level. I started splitting up the project into more modular JS code. And I also spun off the game code from the game engine. So there are two repositories now. And what does it mean, modular JavaScript? I think you have seen it before, like import and export. This is what I'm using quite a lot right now. And it basically gives you more structure and a somewhat level of tidiness in your code. You can have variables and some structures and functions which are only existing in one file, but you can, if you want, you can export them. Here also started sharing code between the game code and the engine code, but I still try to keep it separate. And there's one more cool feature I really enjoyed, having MJS support in modern browsers. You can actually load a module somewhat dynamically from, this is the front-end code, also the back-end code, but it works on the front end as well. So here it depends on what game is supposed to be loaded. It will load the entry point and it will return a structure which the engine can use and then initialize the game code. And there's more to come, so I'm still working on this. But yeah, this also happened, the game code in modern JavaScript and modular JavaScript. Started restructuring in the engine code as well. And I created a GitHub organization. So the Quake Shack has become its own organization on GitHub. And there's some more stuff. I also try to add some documentation as I go. Whenever I find something which is where it's like, okay, I need to document this because it makes sense, because otherwise in 2 weeks I won't remember what I did. And yeah, you can join there. You can look at the code. You can also, there's a link to the current deployment. And yeah, what next? I still have some work to do on the game code reimplementation. There are a couple of entities I haven't added yet. I also need to do some more polishing on the framework, because my goal is it also for enthusiasts to be able to build their own mods on top of this. And I think the structure is decent enough to get it going, but I want to make it more better. And I also want to implement all those entities. And at the same time, I'm also working on a mod. And let's see, as soon as it's getting somewhere, I will talk about this more. And I also want to implement more client-side code. The Quake C code in the original Quake, it's only for the server, not for the client. Even though in modern Quake ports there's client-side Quake C, I haven't looked into this one a lot. I'm more orienting or like getting inspired by how Half-Life did it. And there are a couple of things are already re-implemented. Like there's a new HUD, there's a new scoreboard, there's an event bus, there's some more dynamic stuff, how you can push things around. And then also there's one more thing I really need to work on. It's the network code, because the original port of this engine, it's based on WinQuake, and WinQuake's network code is awful. And John Carmack also noticed back then when he was working on Quake and Quake 2, and when id Software released Quake World, they also fixed a couple of things. and including client-side prediction, which I really want to add as well. So because as soon as you have a latency of above 50, 60 milliseconds, the game becomes more and more laggy, and I want to fix this. And a good way is maybe to implement a Quake words network code. And I already started this by implementing or re-implementing pmove, the player movement code. At some point I discovered like this is almost the same code, like the physics code of what the server is running. And now I'm considering streamlining everything into one code, and then this is shared across the client and server. But anyway, yeah, this is a quick update. And thank you for your interest. It means a lot to me seeing some people being interested in what I'm doing, because like I said, this is a hobby project. I'm not a game developer. I'm just curious in those things, and I'm a huge fanboy of Half-Life and Quake and Doom, and this is what I'm doing in my spare time. Yeah, anyway, if you're still interested and if you want to see more, or if you're new to this project, there's everything is on GitHub. I also try to write down all my thoughts and ideas and to-dos in the .plan file. And if you like to contribute, feel free. I'm also on IC, and there, yeah, you can reach out to me on various ways. Thanks a lot, and see you in the next one.